Lovely. Well, welcome to this Burton Suite charity catch-up. We're delighted that you are here. If you're here and you're a regular with us, welcome back. We're really pleased to see you again. Actually, if you're here for the very first time, then a very, very special welcome to you. My name is Ed Marsh. I'm Head of Charity Development at Burton Suite, and I'm here with my colleague Cecile Gillard, who is Charities Legal Manager here at Burton Suite. And just to let you know how this is going to go, so the event today will be about an hour long, and Cecile and I will take a chance to share with you some various kind of hot topics or content that we hope will be really, really helpful in helping to serve you and your charity today. And that's going to be for around about 45 minutes or so. And then there'll be an opportunity for you to ask any questions you would like to. And you can either do that live, out loud, or actually, if you want to, you can use the chat function on this Zoom meeting to make any comments or observations or questions anytime throughout the event. And we'll pick up on some of those a little bit later on and share them together, and so that we can kind of all learn together from the things that are shared. Just to let you know that this event is being recorded today, particularly for the benefit of those that are signed up but are not able to join us in person. But just to let you know that no names or faces will be included on that recording other than Cecile and I, or unless you kind of come on a bit later on and ask a question. So please be assured of that. But we hope that you make the most of it today and you enjoy it. Just after the event, so this afternoon, we'll send around a bit of a post-event email to you, and that will contain a number of helpful further bits of information, perhaps links, perhaps particular bits of guidance that we've talked about as we've shared today. And also what we'll be doing is sharing a bit of information about how you can join us for an in-person event a little bit later on in May. So stay tuned for that. We'll let you know a bit about that further in the event. We'd also really be grateful as you receive that email, as if you could just drop us a really quick reply and say what you found helpful about the event today, and in particular any feedback about any ways in which you'd like the events to cover different topics or other things in the future, or any ways in which we can improve the way that we do these things. But we're really pleased that you're able to join us. And here's our schedule for today. So we are asking who are you? That's a little bit of a deep question for a Thursday lunchtime, but actually what we're going to be doing today is going back to basics a bit about the legal form for charity, who the people are that are involved in the charity constitutions, really understanding, getting to grips with the basics around that. We're going to be thinking a bit about fund accounting. Fund accounting is an area where actually there can be quite a bit of confusion and misunderstanding, and so we just want to pick up some of the things that we see in practice there, just go through some of the basics, but also highlight some of those key common issues and problem areas around fund accounting. We're going to be thinking about charities and climate action. What does it mean to be a responsible charity? And there's been hot off the press, there's been some news even just in the last couple of days to share with you today. And then we'll do a little bit of a news roundup, a few kind of latest things that are happening in the sector, news that you may or may not have picked up on, and then of course our Q&A at the end. But without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Cecile to kick us off.
Thank you, Ed, and if you could move us on to the poll, if you would, please. So one quick starter question: what's the legal form that your charity has? You can only make one choice, so if you could make that now. If you're not in a charity, think of one that you know and answer it on that. Okay, so I'm going to do a quick countdown. About 71% of you are there. We're nearly all there. I can't see who's answering what, so you're perfectly safe just to make a guess if you're not sure. But the I'm not sure is a good option for that if you're not sure. Okay, so that's probably close to about as far as we're going to get with this. So good 42% think they're a company limited by guarantee, 16% a CIO, a trust, about 21%, nobody thinks they're a members association, 5% of you think you're something else. That's interesting, and I wonder what it is you think you are. And 16% of you are brave enough to say you're not sure, which is great because part of today is about learning. Thank you. Okay, so there's our quick results. Okay, thank you. Great. So thank you, Ed. Move us on to the next image, if you would. We didn't allow you to answer this. We are a charity, and that was quite deliberate because the question was, what is your legal form? And being a charity is about holding a special and very important legal status, which English law gives to some organisations. Has many benefits. It means the organisation also and its trustees have significant responsibilities under charity law. Restrictions and requirements on the charitable assets and how they are used, how the charity pursues its charitable purposes and delivers appropriate public benefit. But it's a legal status, not your legal form. It's very important that you know you're a charity and you know you have that status. So how do you know you have that legal status? Well, in essence, the legal test is about having exclusively charitable purposes that are for the public benefit in a charitable way, which means you need to know a lot about your purposes, what they are, what the outcomes are meant to be, and whether that is of a charitable nature. Many organisations that have this legal status, but not all of them, have to be registered with the Charity Commission and will therefore, if they are registered, show on the public register of charities. But not all charities have to be registered, and being registered is not what makes you a charity. So charities that have to register should be on the register and traceable on the register, but it's not what makes you a charity. Many charities are still legally exempt or accepted from being registered. And a good example of that, which all of you will have come across one way or the other in your lives, is all academy school trusts are charities, but they cannot be registered on the register of charities. Likewise, registered societies, relatively unusual form of charity, but you will find them on other registers, not the charity register, because again, they are not either required or permitted to be registered. So some quite major as well as some quite small charities in things like the social housing sector don't appear on the register for that reason. And very small charities with income under £5,000 are not registered, with one exception. Now, that's your legal status, but every charity has a particular legal form, the particular legal type of organisation that you are. And charities can take quite a wide range of legal forms. Some of the most common I've highlighted up here: a charitable incorporated organisation, a company, usually limited by guarantee, an unincorporated trust, and a members association. There are other possibilities, and one or two of you think you're in one of those other possibilities. Less common though. A charitable incorporated organisation is a special legal form that can only ever be used for charitable purposes. It always is, and it always must remain a charity. And it comes into existence when it's registered with the Charity Commission on the Register of Charities. And it must have members and trustees. Both CIOs and charitable companies have legal identity, independent of their members and trustees. They provide limited liability protection for their members and trustees, with some exceptions. And they can therefore hold and deal with assets, take actions in their own rights, enter into legal agreements, have and enforce legal rights, and have rights enforced by others against them. All of that's really important. But if you're an unincorporated charity, that includes a trust or members association, then the charity doesn't have independent identity, doesn't protect its trustees with limited liability, and people have to act in their own private capacities as trustees. with taking risks in day-to-day activities as well as the extreme scenarios like breaches of trust. Don't confuse a CIO, of course, with a CIC. A CIC, a community interest company, can't be a charity. It is barred by law from being a charity. And inevitably in our day-to-day work, we sometimes see errors where people have got things wrong, sometimes slightly wrong, sometimes badly wrong. We've certainly seen some people sadly set up a CIC and then find they can't apply to register as a charity because they chose the wrong legal form. So your legal form matters because it can affect whether you can be a charity. It matters because you will need to know whether you do or you don't have members. You'll need to know what their rights are and how you respect those. You'll need to know who takes decisions. That might have to be members in some legal forms of charity. You'll need to know how it's regulated and what special requirements and procedures there may be for the charity, and whether you have to register with another regulator like Companies House for a charitable company. And it determines key matters such as those I've touched on. So how do you know what legal form you are? Well, check out the name of the charity. It might give a clue. CIOs ought to have CIO at the end of their name, but some don't. There's been errors in some cases. Most, but not all companies have limited at the end of their name, which can be a clue. Check what your governing document is described as in the trustees' annual report. Check registrations. Look at the charity registration. You need to look at the governance page and the governing document page, and check also any registrations elsewhere, like Companies House. You really need to look very carefully at the evidence this gives you to be sure you know what you're looking at. So if you look, for example, at Brace on the Charity Commission register, you can see its governing document is Declaration of Trust. And a Declaration of Trust is the governing document of a charitable trust. Ed, thanks. Let's move on to the people. And you need to know who the people are and what role they play, because knowing who they are and what their role is helps the good governance and the effective operation of the charity and avoids potential problems and risks. For example, someone claiming to be an employee and make an employment claim against you when you didn't think they were an employee. Trustees, of course, are the governing body of the charity charged with its governance, and you must understand who they are. They might be called something else within the charity and in its governing document, perhaps something rather more old-fashioned like management committee or council of management. Or they might in a charitable company be called directors. Inevitably, trustees in a charitable company are also company directors, but that really is not something to worry about because the important duties and responsibilities come from being a charity trustee. You also need to know whether you're a membership organisation. Do you have members and who are they? Because, as I pointed out a moment ago, some decisions have to be taken by the members. And if that's going to happen in your case, a circumstance arises where you must take a member's decision, vital. You can identify the current members of the charity. You also need to know whether trustees have a dual role, if they are also members. Sometimes they are. In some charities, in other charities, trustees are one group of people, members are another group. In some, trustees are members, but also other people are members who are not trustees. So again, absolutely vital. You can identify who's who and you understand all of that. And a charity may have staff and have an employment relationship with them. It may be using independent contractors who are not paid employees, and there are all sorts of different legal and sometimes tax and VAT implications to that, as well as reporting implications. And you need to know whether you have professional advisors and understand their relationship with you as advisors, with the trustees remaining responsible for decisions. And of course, all charities have unpaid volunteers, and managing that relationship well is really important to ensure effective use of that particular resource of the charity and a positive experience for your volunteers. And then moving on to the Constitution, we need to know what the governing document of the charity is. That is what your Constitution is, the governing document. What is it? Where is it? And understand what is in it. You should be able to find a copy in your charity's own internal records. The Charity Commission does not make copies available on the Register of Charities. If you're a charitable company, a copy of the articles should be on the Companies House website. And it really, really matters because the Constitution binds everybody in the charity, especially the members and the trustees. And it's the internal rule book for the charity. And it addresses really important matters. And it must be obeyed. And your trustees have a legal duty to ensure the charity follows it and acts within it at all times. Failing to do that is a breach of duty. And harm can be done to the charity, and there can be risks of personal liability for trustees or regulatory action against trustees by the Charity Commission when you act outside the Constitution. Within the Constitution, almost always you'll find the charity's charitable purposes, its objects in the old language. Those are vital. Are you there to help relieve the suffering of homelessness, to tackle a particular disease, to provide poverty relief? What are you there to do, and how are you to do it? Can you or must you run a hospice or an overnight shelter for those who would be street homeless? You need to understand who benefits, what you're there to do, and how you can do it, and those things flow directly or indirectly from those purposes. There'll be all sorts of restrictions that reflect your charitable status and protect the charitable assets. And there will be some restrictions on ensuring the charity acts properly and doesn't personally or privately benefit its trustees or any other third parties, or of course people connected to trustees. And it'll deal with a whole range of vitally important things like how trustees are appointed. Think about the name of the Constitution as a clue for finding it, articles for a company, constitution for a CIO, deed or declaration of trust for a trust, usually constitution, but sometimes rules for a members' association, other names for other legal forms of charity. And think about the triggers for change. We're always talking to clients about changing constitutions and helping them do it. Is it out of date to law and practice? Are there gaps and uncertainties in it? For example, a lack of clarity about who can be a member and how they become a member. Do you need to change the trustee board provisions, like how trustees are appointed, introduce limited terms of office, maximum periods of service, get rid of out-of-date rules on who can or must be a trustee, change provisions so you can have new flexibilities on options for the way you hold board meetings. And remember, and this is one of only another example of a long list of reasons for change, that if you're changing the charity into another legal form, you have to adopt an entirely new constitution for the new successor charity. As I say, many reasons for change. That's a quick thumbnail sketch of just some. Over to you, Ed.
Thanks, Cecile. And I hope now you have a better idea of who you are, whether it's before lunch or after lunch. We're now going to think a little bit about fund accounting, and I've got another little poll for you here, which we're just going to launch. And this question, so think about the charity that you're involved in, or perhaps if you're an advisor to charities, think about a particular charity. Do you have any of these funds as far as you know? And now this is one of those where you tick all that apply. So many charities have got kind of more than one type of fund. So do kind of click away, and we'll see where we get to. Thanks very much. Lots of people responding. It might be that some of these terms are a little bit like a foreign language to you, and I hope that by the end of our session, it's something that will be much, much clearer. So I'm just going to allow just a few more seconds, and we're just going to share those results. So yeah, as you can see there, a lot of people, unrestricted general funds. Quite a few of you also had designated funds. Most of you have restricted funds, and at a small percentage, so around about 20% of you have endowment funds. So thank you for responding to that. So those terms may be familiar to you. They might be completely brand new. But what we're just going to do is just go think a little bit about charity funds. You'll see this diagram in the charity SORP, and this really explains what kind of the main types of funds. And so on the left there, we've got unrestricted funds, which might be unrestricted general funds or unrestricted designated funds. And then on the right hand side, they're restricted funds and special trusts, splitting into various different kinds. So we're just going to unpack those briefly together. Unrestricted funds are funds that are spent on any of your charity's purposes at the discretion of the trustees. So any charity, as we've heard, has purposes, has objects in the old language, and they are kind of parameters within which the charity needs to operate to pursue the purposes within these parameters. And what unrestricted funds are funds that the charity holds that they can decide to spend kind of in any way within those parameters to pursue its purposes. And so principally, that's the unrestricted general funds of the charity. But designated funds are where they are also unrestricted funds, but they're where trustees choose to designate, to set aside funds for a particular future purpose. So say my unrestricted funds are £30. And actually I could make a choice as a trustee board together to set aside some of those unrestricted funds as a designated fund. So I'm going to have my little jar here, and I'm going to put £10 in that jar safely. And I'm going to say that this is for a future project, and I'm going to set that aside. But it being a trustee choice, actually at any point I can say, well, that project's not going to go ahead. So I'm going to fish out that £10 note. And they're going to use it for the general purposes of the charity. It's a choice of the trustees. And so it might be, for example, that trustees would set aside funds for, to improve a building. It might be they set aside funds to buy a new vehicle or replacement vehicle. It might be they set aside funds to launch a new service to a particular beneficiary group. But it's a choice of the trustees, and they remain unrestricted and flexible in their application. And so we're going to look at restricted funds, special trusts. What are restricted funds? They're funds that are held on specific trusts under charity law. And this is really important. It's really important to recognise that restricted funds have a legal standing, a legal status. They are legally restricted. Charity law requires them to be treated in a certain way. And the trusts, what they're given under, they establish the purpose for which the funds can be used. So you might have your charity's purposes are these boundaries here. It actually might be that you have restricted funds that actually says of this work here, these funds are for this particular narrower purpose, this particular narrower project or initiative within the scope of the work that the charity does. So that's what a restricted fund is. And they arise in all kinds of different ways. Perhaps one of the most common is that a donor might give a donation, or a grant funder might give a grant, and they say, you must spend this grant on this particular aspect of your work. And so it's donor specified. Another way is where perhaps the trustees decide to make an appeal, for example, for the church roof to be renewed, or give an appeal out to raise money for a particular new project. And actually the setting of that appeal is inviting people to give towards that particular thing. And in doing so, all gifts that are received in response to that appeal are restricted for the particular purpose that the appeal was raised for. And so actually as trustees, we need to be really careful about the way in which we appeal for funds. Actually, if we are appealing to raise money for a particular purpose, that's really fantastic. We just need to be thinking about things like, what happens if we don't raise enough? What happens if it's a failed appeal? What happens if we raise far more than we need for that particular project? Because actually those funds have a legal status and a legal purpose. And of course, this is where quite often a bit of small print comes in. You'll often see on appeal literature a bit of small print that kind of says, actually, if we raise more funds than needed, then the trustees reserve the right to use their discretion to use the monies towards other purposes within the charity's work. And so, these kind of things are really important about the way that we pitch things. The third way in which restricted funds arise are by a charity commission direction, a charity commission order, some kind of way in which the charity commission intervene and say, actually, no, these funds have a legal ring fencing around them. There is no choice of the trustees to de-restrict funds in the way that they would do for unrestricted designated funds. And then on the far right-hand side, we've got what's called endowment funds. And there was a small number of people mentioned that they have endowment funds. And here there's a concept of kind of a long-term use, that they are funds that are usually given to provide an asset base. It's all about financing the long-term future operation of the charity. And actually, there is, for capital funds, this concept of permanence under charity law, that actually this capital is kind of permanently held, either for use by the charity or to raise money for the charity. And so a permanent endowment is exactly that. It's a permanently endowed charity has a capital base that must be preserved. It might be invested for a return to support the work of the charity. It might be a building that is held on special trust that must be maintained and used for the charity in the long run. An expendable endowment, on the other hand, is a capital base. It's a capital fund that's given, but actually there is within that gift the power to convert some of that endowment, that capital, into income, either when certain circumstances arise or when the trustees choose to do so. And so you've got those two particular main types of endowment, permanent and expendable. And the key thing about an endowment is that it's there as a particular fund, but usually any income that's generated belongs either to unrestricted funds. In other words, it's a capital that's raising money for the unrestricted work of the charity, or if actually it's a particular type of endowment, it's raised for perhaps a particular restricted income fund. You never put income back into an endowment fund to accumulate that capital even further, except in one special case, which is total return investing, and we are not going to go down that road today. But if you want to know more about total return investing, I would love to enthusiastically describe what that is to you. So how do we report on funds? Well, there are these key kind of areas that might be familiar looking at your account, that actually in the statement of financial activities, you need to have your funds in columns, the principal fund categories, unrestricted funds, restricted funds, and endowment funds, and make sure that you class your income and your expenditure within those main fund categories. You also need to make sure in your accounts that you've got disclosure information on the major fund movements, so the income, the expenditure, any gains or losses, any transfers, and you need to make sure that that's clear in the notes to the accounts. You need to give a summary of assets and liabilities by fund category. So if you've got debtors, or you've got creditors, or you've got cash in the bank, actually what fund category do those funds belong to? It might be, for some people, they have a balance sheet by fund, which is a perfectly acceptable way of doing it. But then the narrative explanation around funds is really, really vital. You need to be explaining in words any restrictions that are in place, and the purpose and planned use of any sort of designations of any funds that you have in place. So that's really, really important part of the accounts. It's really important to be very clear about what funds are for and what restrictions are in place. And then this is the bit that we don't like, and this is the fact that all of this information needs to be repeated in full for the prior year as well. We need to include all this information by fund in prior year numbers, which is very inconvenient and causes the accounts to be very, very long. This is a common way, you might be familiar to you, is we disclose the fund movements. We've got the funds down the left-hand side, and we talk about the opening balance and the income and the expenditure and the movements there and the closing balance. But of course, for many charities, this gets very, very long. It becomes a very, very big table. So how do we deal with that? I mean, I've probably come across some that are sort of 2 pages long. Well, that's just so much, isn't it? It is possible under the SORT to adopt this kind of approach and say, well, actually, it's only material funds that we need to disclose in the account. So actually, where there's some that have got similar purposes that are smaller, we'll put them on one line. And so you'll see this, but this is a real life example. All funds with an opening balance, closing balance, income, gain, loss or transfer greater than £10,000, they've been separately disclosed, they've been listed separately. But actually all other funds are included in other restricted funds. But we do account for them all separately. So do ask us if you want more information. That is a very kind of good way of doing that. So you might just want to consider whether that's helpful in your case. So I just want to whiz through 13 common issues that we come across as we help people with their accounts and we help people understand their funds. And so we're just going to whiz through these. I think inadequate capture of funds, in other words, people don't recognise that funds exist. They don't recognise that actually they received restricted funds and they need to track those funds. Charity law requires charity trustees to be keeping accounting records for each individual fund. And quite often people don't manage to capture all the funds that exist. They don't realise that when they're making an appeal, what they're doing is creating a restricted fund. Quite often there's gaps in fund history and paperwork, particularly when things go back many, many years. We don't know where that endowment fund came from. We don't know the restrictions around this and who even gave us the money. Let's be really kind to our successors and keep good paper trail around funds that are held by the charity. What do we do about gift aid? Well, the SORP says that gift aid belongs to the same fund that the money was given to in the absence of any different instruction. So do bear that in mind. The SORP also contains a provision around non-binding donor preferences. Every now and then, a donor will come and say, well, I really like this particular aspect of your work and I want to donate to the charity. And my preference is that you might consider using the money for this particular purpose, but actually it's up to you as trustees. The SORP is clear that that's unrestricted funds. That's not restricted. Just because they've expressed a preference is a wish is not the same as a legally binding instruction. Quite often we see in accounts pages and pages of restricted funds, and actually the names of the restricted funds are the names of the donors. It's almost like every single grant funder we need to count as a separate restricted fund. A restricted fund is all about restricted purpose, what it's given for. And so make sure that if you've got funds that are, actually they might be from several different funders, but they're for one purpose, that is one restricted fund, it's not several restricted funds. We often see where charities are given restricted funding, saying you must use this to purchase a particular asset, to purchase a car for use by the charity. And what happens is that the car is purchased and then the funds, the car goes on the balance sheet and it remains in restricted funds. Well, actually, when you bought the car, you discharged the restriction. You did what the funder asked you to do. You bought the car. So actually the funds that represent that car actually now belong to unrestricted funds. It doesn't stay in restricted funds column. How about designating funds that don't exist? Actually, quite often we can be in a situation where a charity has £30 in unrestricted funds, and then what they'll try and do, they'll try and create a designated fund of £40. Well, if I want to put £40 in my jar using £30, it just doesn't work. You can't designate funds that you don't have. You can't create negative general funds by having a big designation. That's something we see quite a lot in practice. And then negative unrestricted funds. Often, well, this is a challenge because it perhaps indicates an insolvency on part of the charity. But actually sometimes overall, it's because actually they've almost effectively borrowed from restricted funds, which potentially is a breach of trust and potentially quite serious. So unless it's kind of a very, very short-term issue, the idea that you might have negative unrestricted funds and then restricted funds balance is a bit of a challenging position. We're getting through. Number 9, a negative balance on a restricted fund. Is this a problem? Well, not necessarily. This is, might be an overspend of a restricted fund, and that's dealt with in one or two ways. Either you need to do a transfer in from your unrestricted funds, or actually it might be that you're expecting after the year end some further funds to come in which case it's perfectly fine to leave it as a negative. We often see trustees say, actually, I want my successors to make sure that they ring fence and use these funds for a particular purpose. So I'm going to create a restricted fund so they cannot legally use it for any other purpose. Trustees do not have the power to do that unless they're given that power by the Charity Commission. You can't create a restricted fund other than by putting an appeal out there. Accounting for endowment income and expenses, I've mentioned about where income needs to go, but quite often it's a bit of a question. If we've got investment management costs, if we've got particular expenses of preserving the value of endowment, where do they go? It's a bit of a debate, that one. Most commonly they go with the endowment fund, the expenses, but sometimes there's other approaches taken. The real problem, I think, quite often with vague designated funds, sort of setting funds aside, and you're wondering, I wonder what this purpose is. I wonder actually whether this is a genuine designation at all, or whether it's window dressing. It's a way of making our free reserves look a little bit lower than they really are. And so being specific about the purpose of designated funds is really important. And then finally, do the funds belong to the charity at all? There's a concept in the charity SORP about funds received as an agent. It might be very well that actually you're holding funds and administering on behalf of another entity. Well, they are not your funds at all. They do not belong in your balance sheet. They do not belong in your accounts, other than to disclose those in a note and say that you're administering on behalf of the other charity. So that's often a question. Actually, are these our funds at all? So fund accounting there, do post any questions in the chat to answer a little bit later on. Meanwhile, I'll hand back to Cecile.
Thank you, Ed. So we're going to move on to think about charities and climate action, but in a much wider context about what it means to be a responsible charity. So I think we have a poll on this as well, Ed. Thank you. Please answer this question. Okay, we're doing well on responses. Keep them coming in. If you haven't answered yet, please do. Okay, we'll close that off just a couple more seconds and let's see what we've got from that. So about 19% of you have a policy without considerations on ethical or responsible investment. 33% have a policy that does include those elements. 19% don't have a policy and think you need to do something about it. That's clearly an action point. And about just under 30% don't have one and don't think you need one. My observation on the latter, I think, is be careful. If you have spare funds invested anywhere, to a certain extent, you need some level of investment policy, even if you keep them in a very low income deposit account. So maybe you might need one and you don't think you do. Okay, thank you. Useful. So in terms of thinking about ethical considerations, it's still quite a decent percentage, but actually a minority sport, as they say. Which brings us on to think about what being a genuinely responsible charity is all about. It's about climate and environment, is it? Should trustees now be thinking about taking direct climate-related action? Or should they be thinking about putting a specific climate harm-related programme in place as a key activity of the charity and spending the charity's funds on campaigns and actions for any of those things? Well, come back to your charitable purposes before you start making any decisions on those. Just because something is of general public importance, as climate and the environment clearly are, or something of societal concern, as by and large, again, those two subjects certainly are, just because of that doesn't mean necessarily the charity should actually be using its resources on direct action on any of those things. You have to apply your resources in an appropriate way to your charitable purposes. You also, of course, need to balance other societal responsibility and societal impact. Certainly thinking about how your charity impacts on climate change and the environment and how you can perhaps minimize damage from that may be a factor to weigh up, but you need to balance that with a whole range of other dimensions on how you impact for good and potentially acceptable levels of the inevitable incidental negative outcomes from your activities. So factors that you might need to address are things like living wage levels, quality of life, tackling other social ills like forced labour and modern slavery, the mental health crisis. These could all be dimensions of societal responsibility that are important to the good governance and good stewardship of your charity. Because, of course, as a charity trustee, you have to display good stewardship to all charity resources. And focusing back in on the charitable purposes time and time again is really important for all of that. Trustees need to get the balance right, balanced behaviours, well-reasoned decisions to deliver good governance and good stewardship. They need to think about relevant factors and concentrate on those as they make decisions, as they discuss direction for the charity, disregarding factors that are of minor relevance or, of course, no relevance to the charity's overall benefit and good. And in matters of environment and climate, of course, it's much more complicated than some of us might perhaps initially think. Just taking the example of considering re-equipping a fleet of vehicles as electric vehicles, there are, of course, complicated, harmful environmental factors in how electric vehicles are manufactured, maintained, and what happens to them at end of life. It isn't a simple or good scenario. Ed, thanks. Move us on. Which brings us to the responsible making and management of investments. About 94% of charities asked in a recent survey felt that it was important to think about responsible management of the charity's investments. Small sample, admittedly, as these surveys often are, but it's clearly a matter where trustees are starting to give thought. Responsible investments is the term the Charity Commission now uses for what it previously called ethical investments. And there are some long-standing critical legal principles here. You need to understand that trustees don't have complete freedom to make ethical decisions based just on what they believe is best for the environment or tackling climate change, or indeed any other societal factors. They have to weigh up and balance a whole host of factors. Critically, on the legal principles, charities have always been able to make a financial investment choice to avoid investments that directly contradict their charitable purposes. So a Quaker Meeting House charity choosing not to invest in arms, a cancer research charity choosing not to invest in tobacco manufacture. And trustees can also make a positive choice to invest in organisations that directly further their charitable purposes. So a charity advancing the prevention of heart disease might choose to invest in companies that promote health practices independently evidenced to reduce heart disease risks. So there are positive choices that can be made. Sometimes also a charity can choose an investment option in order to use stakeholder activism to influence the business in question to make positive choices directly relevant to the purposes. And other factors can influence the trustee's decision-making on which investments to both make and avoid, if, but only if, there is sufficient evidence properly balanced with all the other factors to show how that will be in the charity's best interests. For example, an anti-child exploitation charity avoiding investing in a business that might potentially be using child labour in the manufacture and supply chain, not only, of course, for the protection of children, but because of the risk of losing donor support. And obviously, all of that has to be weighed against limiting factors in the governing document, a direct prohibition on certain types of investment, or particular requirements about how investment objectives are set and decisions made. So the key principles that all trustees can allow to influence their investment choices must always, one way or the other, take into account the charity's purposes as well as its overall best interests. And provided trustees take reasonable and justifiable decisions, there is some flexibility on taking into account responsible investment judgments, which could include environmental and climate-related matters as factors within all of those you weigh up. But within that, trustees don't have complete freedom, as I've pointed out, and trustees can be a little nervous about limiting their options, reducing the best financial return. Even though in practice, responsible financial investments now often give equal or even better returns than some other options. There is Charity Commission guidance on charities and investment matters. It's quite lengthy, it's quite detailed. You should, however, have had a look at it and considered it, but it is old. It predates some important legal developments like the special social investment legal provisions. It doesn't really in any way address modern understandings around responsible investments and the context we're now living in with the increasing focus on the environment and climate. And the Commission recognises that there are some doubts and anxieties amongst trustees relating to responsible investment. So it had consulted on very limited changes to its guidance, which actually needs a complete overhaul, but we're not going to get that. And it asked some questions about possible changes, but then it paused because two charities brought a case to the High Court, asking for legal ruling that would support the alignment they had made with their investment policies in relation to the climate change related goals of the Paris Agreement. And just the High Court has issued its judgment in favour of those two charities. But be careful here, that's not a carte blanche. It's on the basis that the trustees of those charities in their circumstances took a balanced view of relevant factors and used their investment powers reasonably and lawfully, looking at factors like what was consistent with their charity's purposes and possible investment conflicts with those, looking at the scientific evidence of climate change, looking carefully at what investments they were going to deliberately avoid and not excluding ones that were inappropriate perhaps to exclude, and taking a justifiable long-term view on the intended financial returns. What this means is that the Commission can now go ahead and complete its review of its guidance just on responsible investments, which is all it intends to do, and issue some changes at some point. Besides investments, of course, and responsible investments, trustees can also think about other responsible financial management, and I do think they should. And I do think perhaps many of them actually don't do that enough. They should be increasingly mindful to make responsible choices about, for example, which bank they use, how they manage their staff pension fund, the dialogues they have with current and potential suppliers and service providers. On climate and environment, yes, but on those other relevant societal factors that are relevant to their circumstances. And those should be factors that balance your decisions and your reviews of how you go about other aspects of the charity's financial management. Ed, thanks. Another visual. And responsible charities in terms of reporting are already addressing some optional areas on environment and climate change, some comments in their trustees' annual report, particularly about the impact these things are having on their charity, about this being the context in which we now work as part of our overall context. Not necessarily that we're doing any direct climate or environment related programme, but this is part of our important governance and operational context, but only part. Where the issues they seek to address are very directly affected by climate and environmental factors, then certainly they are adopting appropriate positions on that and taking appropriate action. And a really good example of that, of a large charity, a well-known charity, is Save the Children Fund, which has done some excellent independent research on the extent to which environmental factors are exacerbating risks to children in poverty and other high-risk situations that the charity is there to address. And as a result, that has informed, as one of the factors, their current strategy, as well as their specific environmental policy. Compulsory reporting is necessary for a small number of charities at the moment in just a limited area. That is, if they're a large charitable company, large under the Companies Act, they have to currently report in their annual trustees report on UK energy usage and associated greenhouse gas emissions, and give information about their energy efficiency. That's quite narrow, and it only affects a very small number of charities on the register. And finally, what might be coming? Well, the next SORP is due to be issued in 2025. It might include a requirement for most charities to report on their impact on the environment and the effects of climate change on the pursuit of their charitable purposes. How is it impacting on your charitable purposes? Still early days, we don't know that certain, we will need to wait for the detail. Ed, over to you.
Thank you, Cecile. We just wanted to let you know, before we just share a couple of news items, but also take questions. We have, in 3 weeks' time, Cecile and I are involved in speaking at an in-person conference in Bristol. And this is hosted by the Chartered Institute of Management Accountants. And actually, if you're a CIMA member, you can get a discounted place, but actually everybody can book in and come along to that event. So actually, if this isn't quite enough and you'd appreciate kind of 3 hours plus lunch, we would love to see you at that event. It's been a while since we have been able to deliver in-person training, so we're really, really looking forward to this event. So do book in for that. That link that's on the screen will also come around in the post-event email as well, and we'd love to see you there as we explore many of these topics, but many more in much more depth. A great kind of learning opportunity. So that's at the Future in Bristol in 3 weeks' time for the morning. We do have a couple of questions, but I'll just quickly, before we go to those questions, Cecile, perhaps just to ask you whether just a couple of quick items of news for a couple of minutes.
Surely. Firstly, a quick reminder about being careful about informal fundraising initiatives carried out by people, particularly those outside your charity's control. There's been a number of really very sad incidents recently where someone, particularly using online fundraising, has involved people, quite innocent people, who've in all good conscience gone off and raised funds. And in some of those cases, I'm afraid there are allegations now that thousands of pounds have been spent by the person behind the scheme for their own private purposes, and that the charities haven't seen a penny of it. You obviously want to raise funds and have people raise them for you, but please be careful on that. Secondly, related to that electronic online point that was involved in some of those cases, this is World Password Day, people. If by any chance you are silly enough to be using 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 or password, once you leave this event, go off, review, change. I joke, but my point is, keep an eye on your charity's digital security and online safety, please. Charity Commission has recently issued an alert on the risks of criminal sexual abuse, harassment, and other exploitation of people who are fleeing Ukraine. I think many people thought that that was an issue for charities working on the ground or funding in other parts of Europe. Regrettably, the abuses are now extending to criminal activity in the UK. So if your charity is involved in being partners, hosting or helping settle refugees here, helping them find a pathway through officialdom, any of those things, I'm afraid this is a thing where you need to review risk and be alive to it. And finally, the Charity Commission's new chair has just taken office and made his first public speech. There was a lot about regulation and taking a robust approach in it, highlighting the need to investigate concerns and act where there's evidence of misconduct or mismanagement, but with an acknowledgement that balancing being robust and being, as he put it, benign are important. And he did say, slightly more positively, that robust regulation helps keep a secure charity environment so the, quotes, numerous acts of kindness and love in the sector can thrive. Well, so say all of us. Good stewardship is one of those more positive ways to do that. We have to live with the regulation that the Commission's chair believes also helps that.